Today is August 23rd, 2024, and this is the OSU Turfgrass Team Times. Online today we have Dr. Drs Gardner and Dr. Tyler Carr. Conditions have been in some ways fruitful along the lines that the last week temperatures were relatively moderate. We did have some rainfall early in that period of time. And so a lot of the lawns have started to recover really, where we've seen a lot of greening up going on in places in the Cleveland, Northern Ohio area for sure. But the forecast is less than promising. So we'll have to take that into account when we're making pretty important decisions in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But first and foremost, Dr. Gardner, herbicide weed update.
All right, good morning, everybody. Yeah, this is an interesting time of the year because when it's hotter and drier at this time of the year, it tends to be not as traumatizing as when it's hot and dry like in July because of the angle of the sun. That said, it's still going to be a pretty stressful environment for attempting to do things like, establish turf from seed. And so if you're in a situation where you're not able to provide the irrigation that's necessary, which in the middle of the summertime is up to 5 times a day, and at this time of the year, it's probably more like 3 to 4 times a day, I would hold off on putting out your seedlings until as late as possible. So with Kentucky bluegrass, you can get away with seeding turf as late as the 15th of September. All of the other species as late as the 30th of September. And as long as the weather forecast remains as it is, which is temperatures hovering near 90 and no rain in the forecast, that's not particularly conducive to good seedling growth and development. So I would hold off if you don't have the ability to provide regular irrigation. Now, one of the things that I discussed at Field Day was the control of crabgrass, and one of our go-to combinations for that is a half a rate of quinclorac and a half a rate of tebramazone. And this was 14 days after I made the application on the 2nd of August, and based on this picture, you could say that my control is not particularly impressive. But you know how I usually drone on about how crabgrass becomes almost magically more vulnerable to these herbicides later in its life cycle. Well, this is 7 days after I made the second application, which was August 23rd, a week ago. And you can see that whereas the crabgrass basically was injured a little bit, but recovered from the first application made in early August, it was basically crispy brown dead 4 days after I sprayed the second application, and it's basically gone. So if you're still struggling with crabgrass and you didn't have a lot of luck with your first attempt at controlling it post-emergence, know that now you should be able to expedite its seasonal decline, very quickly. That said, you'll want to map those areas out for application of a pre-emergence herbicide next year because it has probably had a chance to complete its life cycle, which means that there's all kind of seed on the ground to repopulate those stands next year. Speaking of pre-emergence herbicides, if you struggled with winter annuals, it won't be more than a month before germinating winter annuals start to look like this in bare places in the lawn. And so, things like chickweed and henbit and bittercress, purple dead nettle, if you had a big problem with those, remember that a pre-emergence herbicide application made in the month of September may provide you with better control than attempting to control post-emergence in November, but both of those are definitely better options than attempting to control those weeds post-emergence next spring. Short and sweet today, Ed.
Thank you, David. Dr. Carr.
So, Dr. Gardner, you're pretty much saying if you need to make that decision on if you want to seed pretty soon, and if you're not, that's the green light to put out a pre in September. And if you want to seed, make sure you don't put that pre out for obvious reasons.
That's probably a good point. Yes, our pre-emergence herbicides are very good at preventing Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass, and tall fescue from germinating. So yes, you can either control your winter annuals or you can overseed. You cannot do both.
Okay, that's a good disclaimer to put out every now and then.
That said, if you do put out your seedlings and you did have trouble with winter annuals, put down mesotrione with the seed, and that will go a long ways towards preventing the winter annual weed problem that you had last year.
Okay, awesome. So piggybacking off of that, he mentioned delaying seeding for a little while. Let me pull this up. So last year we built a blog series of blog posts into our turf website. This is buckeyeturf.osu.edu, our main page here. On our blog piece, we have many posts on turfgrass establishment, which can be used to supplement the video series that is on this YouTube page. Lots of different steps put together by turf personnel here at OSU. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about species and cultivar selection. Dr. Nangle's student, Miranda Berger, put together this post last year talking about some of the different species that we use, turfgrass cultivar selection, seeding rates, and seed labels. But I want to just spend a little bit of time on the different turfgrass species. Dr. Gardner mentioned seeding Kentucky bluegrass a little bit earlier than the other species we have. It's going to take much longer to establish. But aside from the establishment piece, I would say that traditionally Kentucky bluegrass has been the predominant turfgrass species in Ohio for lawns. But when I talk to distributors, contractors, they're putting out a lot of tall fescue these days. And I see a good reason for it. We typically don't think about Ohio being an area that we have irrigation shortages or water shortages. But the last 2 summers, we've gone through these periods of drought that have really declined the quality of turf. And so while we're not just going through 100, 150 days of, extreme drought, even though we are in some areas of the state currently, that's not normally a routine thing. We do need some grasses that, if we want good quality turf, we do need to plant grasses that are going to give us better drought resistance. The tall fescues and the fine fescues are going to give us more drought resistance than something like Kentucky bluegrass. Tall fescue is going to be more, I would say, more of a functional turf than fine fescue. The fine fescues don't necessarily respond to traffic too well, whereas tall fescues have a bit more traffic tolerance. Perennial ryegrass looks good in the fall and spring, but in the summer, it can be kind of tough to manage perennial ryegrass, but it's often in seed mixes. So when you have these different species, within those species are cultivars, and they vary in their drought resistance as well and other characteristics. So there are a couple sources that you can go to when you're purchasing seed. You've decided on your species. You need to figure out what cultivars you want. A couple resources we have on our turf website. We can, under our fact sheets, link to a fact sheet that Dr. Nangle led a couple years back on cultivar selection. So this talks about cultivar development and selecting these cultivars, but there's a list down here of these different species and cultivars within them that have been the top performers in cultivar evaluation trials at some of our neighboring universities in Michigan and Indiana. So you see these different, the fescues, the ryegrass, and the bluegrass. There are other groups that certify cultivars on drought resistance or low input, on having better quality under reduced inputs. So one of them is the Alliance for Low Input Sustainable Turf. They certify varieties that, or approve varieties that perform well under reduced inputs period, from fertilizer, mowing, irrigation, pesticides. You may see this seal on bags at the big box store or from a distributor, but there are some approved varieties here. And you can find this list on their website. And also the Turfgrass Water Conservation Alliance. You may also see their seal on approved blends and their list of qualified cultivars here for Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass, tall fescue, and fine fescue. And so as these new genetics get out, they will certify, or they'll test new genetics to figure out if they meet these meet the standards for reducing inputs. The Turfgrass Water Conservation Alliance essentially just puts these grasses under severe drought stress and sees which cultivars stay green longer. that could provide us an opportunity to, we go through 30 or 40 days, sometimes at the longest, without measurable rainfall or much rainfall. Um, some of these grasses may allow us to have more turf quality in that period. So once I find a way to not share my screen, we'll move on. Okay, we're good.
Thank you, Dr. Carr. I think one thing we need to emphasize, and we were discussing this prior to going quote unquote live, was the idea of supplying irrigation to the seed. Ultimately, if you're going to make the decision to seed in the next week, which we're not recommending based on temperatures and the lack of rainfall, you must have either access to irrigation or do not turn on the irrigation whatsoever. The problem with it is once the seed starts imbibing any of that water in there, processes are going to start occurring internally in the seed, and it is going to start to germinate, and you're in a situation that you cannot get out of. So once the grass seed starts to germinate, we see the radicle and the cotyledon start to emerge, you're going to have to continue watering. Now, one thing that homeowners in particular run into with irrigation practices is how frequently you should do it. Again, we're not recommending this for next week because of the heat and humidity, purely because if you do get germination next week and you continue to water, the propensity for damping off and seedling diseases is going to be extremely high unless you put down a fungicide. So the practice or application of irrigation in these types of conditions, and I'm talking about specifically today. So the high temperature today in Worcester, I think, is about 75 to 80 degrees, right? This would be ideal condition for seeding if you have water. Really, you want to be applying water 4 times a day, 2-3 minutes per time, maybe a little bit more. You want that surface moist, but not with standing water, right? Those are going to be critical things to keep in mind. And so that approach is going to be extremely important. And if you can do anything to get the seed down into the soil itself, now not 6 inches into the ground, but in that top 10th or top quarter of an inch. So if that includes raking the surface, breaking it up in a way that gets the seed protected and has enhanced seed soil contact, that will also aid your establishment. Dr. Carr, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just briefly, and many of our listeners may know this, but you can buy, even if you don't have an irrigation system, you can buy battery powered controllers that you hook to a hose bib that will allow you to irrigate up to multiple times a day. You can get it to, I think, irrigate maybe every hour or every 2 hours for a certain amount of time. So you don't have to be home necessarily to let that run, but they're very cost efficient or cost effective. Not super expensive.
Yeah. And I've been working with a couple of entities up in the Cleveland area. For those who are going to start those applications, if you're late, you're still fine. The only downside is if you're trying to take out rough bluegrass, potentially, Dr. Gardner, this would have been the best week to do it, because I'm assuming next week the rough bluegrass is probably going to go backwards as far as dormancy with those temperatures.
Yeah, I think if you're trying to get rid of rough bluegrass, you're talking more about a late fall renovation and then overseeding in the spring.
Right. So that's not going to be an ideal solution. With that, I will wrap it up. A couple of things. The OTF scholarship outing is at York Country Club. Keep an eye out for that. It does go towards helping the turfgrass program. The ATI scholarship outing is on October 7th at Westfield Golf Club. And that helps with our scholarships up here. And then that second full week in December, bear in mind, we're getting ready for that with the OTF conference and show. And Dr. Carr and the Education Committee have been doing a lot of work getting materials together for the various tracks we have. And we've got people of the likes of Dr. Terry Bailison coming in. We also have Dr. Paul Koch coming in from University of Wisconsin. And we also have, come with me, Dr. Carr, help me out here. Who's our herbicide specialist?
So Dr. Jim Brosnan
Coming in from
and
University of Tennessee.
Scott McElroy coming in
from Auburn.
So Rock Gaswan from Nebraska, Amanda Folk from Nebraska, Kel Bigelow from Purdue University. And hopefully I didn't miss anybody.
Nothing personal if we forgot.
Yeah.
With that, we will wrap it up and we will talk to you next week. It is still August, but for the older generation, and I'm not discriminating, I'm just talking about the crew who would talk about the 100-day battle. I noticed it last night that the intensity was somewhat dissipated out of the sun by about 6:30 in the evening. And so that 100-day battle, I think, is over. Now, next week may see a return of a sting in the tail, but we will continue as is. Dr. Carr can put up the contact details of the websites. So if you want to catch it, Dr. Carr has something to add. Oh no, he's sharing.
No, I was just pulling that up. Sorry.
Okay, so our website, like Dr. Carr mentioned, buckeyeturf.osu.edu. If you need to send us an email with a question, and we do get them, and I think anyone would say we've been very responsive to the questions coming in. And then the various X or Twitter handles along with the podcast material.